So, across the Percy Jackson series, we see a few different glimpses into the underworld, and in the Heroes of Olympus, Percy and Annabeth venture into Tartarus. One of the coolest pieces of the underworld is the collection of 5 rivers, which comes straight from actual Greek mythology. So today, we wanted to talk about each of these 5 rivers, what they did, what they were used for, and how they play into the overall anatomy of the underworld. Probably the most famous river, and the one we're first introduced to chronologically in the Percy Jackson series, is the River Styx. This is the river that Achilles was dipped in when he was born, and the same one that Percy and Luke both ended up swimming in so that they could become indestructible just like Achilles. But this river actually has a functional purpose for being in the underworld. It's not just present to grant heroes unrivaled combat potential. This was the barrier of the underworld that separated the dead and the living, and it made sure that the souls of the underworld could not leave, nor could the living enter the underworld without permission. The only way across was to pay Charon the ferryman, and if a wayward soul ever wandered into the Styx, it would rip apart their essence and shred the soul. So there were only a few ways that someone could ever come back from the underworld. Even crazier than this, however, is that Styx was not just a river, but a primordial goddess that we first got to meet in the Dark Prophecy. The reason why swearing on the River Styx is the most binding pledge that anyone can make is because during the First Titan War, Styx was the first to pledge her loyalty to Zeus, and became his oldest ally. At the time, the Titans were in power just like the gods are now, and Zeus was the underdog, so gathering allies was a massive challenge for the youngest son of Kronos. In exchange, he made swearing by Styx the most sacred of bonds, and this is why across the series, so many characters swear on the Styx. Styx, however, isn't the only river to embody the will of a god, and next we want to talk about Acheron. In the House of Hades, Percy and Annabeth encounter the House of Night and the goddess Nyx, but in order to escape, they have to follow the banks of the Acheron. This is often referred to as the River of Pain or the River of Woe, and it acts as punishment for those who have committed crimes in their mortal lives. It's described as a collection of agonized voices that have all been gathered into one place, and the voices are becoming indistinguishable from one another. When Percy and Annabeth come up to it, they see flashes of every monster they've killed and every one of their friends who died as a result of their actions. Annabeth sees flashes of Zoe Nightshade, Selena Beauregard, Bianca D'Angelo, and most agonizingly, she sees Luke. The Acheron taunts her, calling her a murderer and beckoning her to jump in because she deserves it. But in The Sun and the Star, we find out that this is just a reflection of someone's own guilt. It doesn't actually blame Annabeth, it just brings out her own inner guilt about each of the people that she inadvertently got killed. When Nico and Will get to the underworld, they meet Gogira, who lives on the banks of the Acheron and can provide them with a canoe which will lead them downstream. They end up forgiving themselves for their crimes, and since they don't feel deserving of punishment, the river no longer has any effect on them. The god Acheron, however, was once an actual entity, but his essence has become so thin that Gogira doesn't know if there's any difference between him and the river anymore. These two converge, and together they form a sort of moat around Erebus before spilling into the pits of Tartarus. But there are 3 more rivers to talk about, so let's go to the River Lethe, or the River of Forgetfulness. In the Demigod Files, Percy, Nico, and Talia have to cross the River Lethe before confronting Aeptus the Titan, and Percy is only able to avoid getting his memory wiped since he doesn't get wet underwater. The purpose of the Lethe is actually directly tied to the souls in Elysium, the good afterlife for the souls of heroes. There's another video on the channel about the different paths that a soul can take once they reach the underworld, where we talk a lot more about Elysium. But basically, the gates of Elysium are a peaceful community where heroes get to live out the rest of blissful eternity. There is, however, one step above the halls of Elysium, and that's the Isles of the Blessed, which is a tropical island paradise for the 1% of the 1%, and the only way to get to the Isles of the Blessed is to be reborn from Elysium and make it back to Elysium after death 3 times in a row. This is the highest standard for any soul, but in order to leave the underworld and be reborn into a new life, the soul has to bathe in the River Lethe in order to completely forget their previous life. This will completely strip an individual of their identity, set their mind back to its factory settings, and we know it works on mortals, souls, and even godly figures. This is where Bob the Titan comes from, because originally, he was named Aeptus, the Titan of the West and ally of Kronos. In the Demigod Files, Percy, Talia, and Nico are only able to beat him by soaking him in Lethe water and getting him to completely forget himself. Bob is the new person that Percy and Nico befriended, so we know that Lethe can seemingly work on just about anyone if even Titans are able to be affected by it. Next we have the River Cocytus, which so far as we know is the only river of the underworld that is even semi-safe to swim in. This doesn't mean it's safe to swim in, but it's at least the most survivable. If someone swims in the Styx, there's only a small chance they come out alive, and if someone swims in the Acheron, they're ripped apart and their soul is assimilated into the millions of agonizing voices that make up the wailing of the Acheron. Then, of course, swimming in the Lethe is survivable, but your mind will be completely gone when you get out. In the House of Hades, Percy and Annabeth land in the River Cocytus, or the River of Lamentation, which is described as dark, inky blue, and unbearably freezing. This river can strip a person of their will to live, and Percy immediately wants to give up and drown when he falls in. This is the river of hopelessness, and completely embodies the spirit of Tartarus itself, which Percy and Annabeth tell Nico and Will at the beginning of The Sun and the Star. They say that Tartarus quite literally strips their will to go on, and that in order to survive Tartarus, they need to rely on each other, and we can see this throughout the entirety of their time in the House of Hades. The only reason why they're able to get through Tartarus is because they had each other and are able to at least marginally hold on to some sense of hope. We know that the rivers of the underworld flow in a circular pattern, so continuing to follow these rivers will eventually get you back to the underworld. But Tartarus has to demoralize anyone from trying to get back to the surface. This is why monsters are so slow to reform, and why the Doors of Death were so vitally important to the rise of the giants, because otherwise, even the most powerful monsters and giants have to claw their way out of Tartarus, which can take decades. If Tartarus can destroy the morale and will for creatures to escape, it dramatically slows down the process even further, which brings us to the final river of the underworld, the Phlegethon. The River Phlegethon, or the River of Fire that Annabeth and Percy come across in Tartarus, seems like this is the only river with health benefits at first glance. They are able to drink from it and endure Tartarus, but Annabeth sheds some more light on exactly why the Phlegethon exists. In the House of Hades, she says that this is how souls endure the torment of the underworld. It's not meant to be hopeful, it's meant to be life support, so that Tartarus can keep torturing its victims without having their essences ripped apart. This isn't hope, it's endurance, and the only reason why Percy and Annabeth were even able to escape Tartarus in the first place is because the Doors of Death have been chained, and they were able to get the support of both Bob and Damison. What's interesting about each of the five, however, is they all have applications outside of the underworld, since they're theorized to quite literally be the blood of Tartarus himself. We know that Leo was able to use water from the rivers to power the Argo too, and that by drinking from the rivers of memory and forgetfulness, that Apollo was able to prepare himself to enter the cave of Trophinus. It's also confirmed that the Hypnos cabin is water from the Lethe, since the soaked branch of the poplar tree is a symbol of Hypnos. But it's cool to consider that the waters of these rivers can be used as tools outside of their intended purposes. So that's a rundown of the 5 rivers of the underworld. If there's any specific topics you want us to talk about, please let us know and join in the conversation. We love this series, we love talking about this series, so we'd love to hear your thoughts.